The soft buzz of pre-flight announcements hummed through the cabin of Flight 792 from Houston to Charlotte, just loud enough to rise above the shuffle of passengers storing bags and claiming seats. Raina Morgan stood near the middle of the narrow aisle, boarding pass in hand, waiting patiently behind a family struggling to get their overhead bags settled. She held her duffel close, her fingers gently drumming on the strap as she exhaled quietly. Travel didn't usually make her anxious. Raina had spent much of her early 30s flying in and out of cities for consulting gigs. But something about this trip felt different. This time, she wasn't running toward work. She was heading home, for the first time in months. As she approached row 17, she found her assigned window seat, 17A, and slid in gratefully, tucking her bag beneath the seat in front of her. She leaned against the cool plastic frame of the window, letting her eyes drift toward the tarmac beyond. The clouds were pale and slow-moving above the runway, and for a brief moment they brought her peace. Raina had deliberately chosen this seat, paid extra for it in fact, not because she loved the view, though it was a bonus, but because she'd learned that the window seat offered something deeper: silence. It was the one spot where she could lean away from the world and not be touched, not be asked, not be seen unless she wanted to be. For a black woman navigating a corporate world that often read her confidence as defiance and her silence as indifference, the window was her pause, her breath, her choice. She was settling in, a book already resting on her lap, when a sharp voice broke through her calm. "Excuse me," the man said, with a tone that was more direct than inquisitive. "You're in our seat." Raina blinked and looked up. A man, tall, sharply dressed in a navy blazer and khakis, stood over her with a little girl beside him, no older than 5 or 6, her fingers clutching a faded unicorn backpack. Her dark curls peeked out from beneath a pink hoodie, and her eyes darted around the cabin with a kind of practiced worry. The man's face, however, showed no signs of hesitation. Raina pulled her boarding pass from the side pocket of her tote and held it up. "This is 17A," she said calmly. "That's what's printed here." The man glanced at the seat label, then back at Raina. "I understand," he replied, tight-lipped. "But my daughter needs the window seat. She gets nervous on flights. Surely you understand." There was no apology in his voice, no room for conversation, just a certainty that she would oblige. Raina looked at the girl, then back at the man. "I do understand," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But I chose this seat for a reason. I paid for it." Something flickered in the man's eyes. Surprise, maybe even disbelief. He glanced down at the girl, then back at Raina, his voice stiffening further. "You'd deny a child the chance to feel safe just because of a seat?" The implication hung heavy in the air. Raina felt it like a shift in temperature, that familiar current of subtle blame, the socially acceptable shame laced with politeness. She sat straighter. "I'm not denying anyone's safety," she said. "I'm sitting in the seat I paid for." The man exhaled through his nose, a sharp sound that felt more performative than necessary. Passengers nearby began to glance over. The girl tugged lightly at his hand, whispering something Raina couldn't make out. He ignored her. "This is unbelievable," he muttered, then raised his voice slightly, not yelling, but enough to invite the surrounding rows into the drama. "People today have no sense of decency." The words stung, not because they were true, but because they were familiar. Dressed in different clothes, they had followed Raina her entire adult life. She'd heard them in meetings where her assertiveness was labeled as aggression, at counters where her questions were dismissed before they were answered. She'd heard them whispered in classrooms, echoing in the sideways glances of colleagues who saw her presence as audacity. But before she could respond, a calm, grounded voice broke in. "Is there an issue here?" A flight attendant, a woman in her early 50s with silvering braids tied back neatly, and a practiced composure that carried authority without volume, had approached. Her name tag read Clarice. She looked from Raina to the man and his daughter, her expression neutral but alert. Yes, the man replied quickly, seizing the moment. This woman is refusing to switch seats so my daughter can sit by the window. She has anxiety. It's a small task. Clarice turned to Raina. May I see your boarding pass? Raina handed it over without a word. Clarice examined it, then nodded and handed it back. She's in her assigned seat, Clarice said plainly. I'm afraid I can't ask another passenger to move from a confirmed seat. But it's a child, the man pressed, eyebrows lifting with the confidence of someone used to being accommodated. I'm sure there's a middle ground here, Raina spoke up, her voice level. I understand your daughter might be anxious. I'm not unsympathetic, but I chose this seat for a reason, and I believe if this were truly important to you, you'd have booked accordingly. A murmur moved through the rows. A few passengers looked away. Others stared openly. Raina could feel the collective breath of the cabin held just beneath the surface. The man stepped back, eyes narrowing. This is what the world has come to, he muttered. A grown woman so selfish she can't spare a window seat for a child. Clarice stood her ground, but said nothing. It wasn't the first time Raina had been labeled selfish for setting a boundary, for asserting a right she had earned. But it stung more because this time it was public. And the target wasn't just her, it was her character. Still, she didn't move, she didn't explain further, she didn't shrink. Because something in her had grown tired of the expectation that grace should always come from her, that kindness should be her burden, that dignity must always cost her peace. Clarice, still composed, addressed the man directly. Sir, if you'd like to take your assigned seat, I'd be happy to help you find space for your bag. The man huffed, but before walking away, he leaned slightly toward Raina and said, just under his breath, People like you never change. Raina's stomach tightened, not at the insult itself, but at the deliberate vagueness, the way he'd used the words to wound without consequence, to make sure everyone heard just enough, but not too much. But Clarice had heard, her jaw set. Sir, she said firmly, let's not cross a line we can't come back from. He didn't reply, just turned and walked to the back of the plane with his daughter in tow. Raina turned back toward the window. Her fingers were shaking, just slightly, not from fear, but from the familiar exhaustion of holding your place when the world keeps asking you to move. Clarice returned a moment later and crouched by her seat. You did the right thing, she said softly. If you need anything during the flight, you let me know. Raina looked at her, surprised by the sincerity in her tone. She nodded once. Thank you. As the engines roared to life and the plane began to taxi, Raina leaned back in her seat. The clouds outside were shifting, their shapes soft and uncertain. She didn't know what the rest of the flight would hold, but for now, she had kept her seat, and with it, a small, hard-won piece of something more important, something like dignity. The hum of the engine had long settled into a steady rhythm as Flight 792 climbed high above the clouds, carving its invisible path through the late morning sky. Row 17 had grown quiet, but the silence was not peace. It was the kind of stillness that lives in the air after a storm, not destructive, but tense, electric. Raina Morgan sat in her window seat, shoulders slightly drawn, book closed on her lap. Outside, the clouds stretched like continents across the blue expanse, but she wasn't looking. Not really. The man, whose name she still didn't know, had finally taken his seat 5 rows back, across the aisle. From the corner of her eye, Raina had seen him slump into 22C, his daughter curled against the window, her small head resting on her stuffed unicorn. The image should have softened something in her. Once it might have. But the moment had passed, and with it, her patience for men who use their children as shields and guilt as leverage. Clarice, the flight attendant, had passed by twice since takeoff. The second time, she had offered Raina a drink on the house, and a small, warm smile. No words, just a quiet exchange of humanity. Raina appreciated that. The older she got, the more she cherished the quiet solidarity of women who had learned not to explain themselves. 10 minutes later, Raina heard a whisper beside her. You didn't let him win. Raina turned slightly. It was the woman in 17B, seated directly beside her. She was maybe in her mid-40s, with curly dark hair pulled into a low bun, a navy cardigan draped over her shoulders. Her voice was low, but kind. Sorry? Raina asked, unsure if she'd heard correctly. I saw what happened. You didn't back down. That matters. Raina smiled faintly. Thank you, she said. I'm not sure it matters to everyone. It will to someone, the woman replied. Sometimes we don't know who we're standing up for until later. Her words lingered. Raina turned back toward the window. Until later, she thought of her niece, Layla, back in North Carolina. Layla, who was 12 and already learning to navigate the tightrope of being young, black, and too smart for her surroundings. Layla, who had once asked Raina why her teachers always called her confident but never called the white boys that. Maybe it wasn't about the seat. Maybe it was about the thousands of small messages girls like Layla were collecting every day. About who should yield. About who gets to take up space. Half an hour passed. The seatbelt sign flicked off. A gentle voice reminded passengers that beverage service would begin shortly. Conversations resumed in soft murmurings. And then, another voice. I just want to say something. Raina glanced up. It was a man from 2 rows behind, standing awkwardly in the aisle, gripping the headrest in front of him. Early 50s, salt and pepper beard, wedding band glinting as he steadied himself. His eyes met Raina's for only a second before darting away. That man earlier, he continued, his voice carrying just enough to reach nearby rows. He was out of line, and you didn't do anything wrong, Raina blinked. It wasn't grand or rehearsed, but it landed. More passengers looked up. A few nodded subtly. One woman behind her added, some people think they can demand anything when they raise their voice. But that doesn't make them right. Raina felt her throat tighten unexpectedly, not from shame or pride, but from the strange vulnerability of being seen, of having her experience affirmed by people who had been silent during the confrontation but were now finding their voices. Clarice passed through again. This time, she stopped. We're making an incident report, she said quietly, just in case he tries to escalate anything once we land. Would you be willing to add a brief statement? Raina hesitated. Does it really matter? Clarice nodded. It does, especially when someone like that tries to twist the story. Raina thought for a moment, then nodded. Of course. Clarice smiled, then lowered her voice. I want you to know, you weren't alone in that. As she moved on, Raina felt a slow exhale leave her chest. Maybe she hadn't been alone. Not really. Not entirely. And that shift, however small, was everything. By the time the drink cart rolled by, the tension in row 17 had softened. The woman in 17B and Raina had exchanged names. Naomi was a social worker from New Orleans, flying to see her sister in Charlotte. They spoke for a while about family, about work, about the fatigue of having to constantly explain your worth. Naomi had stories of courtroom hearings and exhausted parents, of watching kids find confidence in the smallest of victories. It turned out they had more in common than Raina expected. As they descended toward Charlotte, the cabin once again shifted to quiet anticipation. Belongings retrieved, seat backs straightened, windows revealed the tapestry of neighborhoods and interstates below. Naomi turned to her. You ever think maybe it's not about standing your ground, but showing others they can too? Raina looked out the window. She thought about her niece, about Clarice, about the girl with the unicorn backpack, silent and small. Yeah, she said softly. Maybe that's exactly what it is. The landing was smooth. The taxi to the gate was slow. And yet, as the wheels touched down, Raina felt something shift inside her. Not a dramatic epiphany, but a steadying. She hadn't just held a seat, she'd held the line. And someone, somewhere, would remember that. The engine hum of the plane filled the heavy silence that followed Paul Whitmore's reluctant retreat. Raina Morgan sat still in her window seat, her back straight but her shoulders tight, the book in her lap left untouched. She was no longer reading. Her mind had gone elsewhere, caught in the eddies of what had just happened and what it meant. Around her, passengers whispered, but no one addressed her directly. It was like being seen and unseen at the same time. Outside the small oval window, clouds rolled like cotton hills beneath them, soft and unreachable. Raina stared out, not seeing the clouds at all, but feeling the gravity of every pair of eyes that had shifted, judged, considered her, and, in that crucial moment, decided not to speak, except for one. Marcus, the man in the olive sweater, had spoken with calm clarity, not on her behalf, not as a hero, but as a person unwilling to let a lie stand unchallenged. His voice, quiet but firm, had echoed longer in Raina's mind than the shouting. It reminded her of her father, a librarian who always said that silence can be noble, but not when it's mistaken for agreement. She took a slow breath and turned her gaze slightly, catching Marcus's eye across the aisle. He offered a soft nod, one that said, "You're not alone," and then returned to his own book. It was a small thing, but in that moment it meant more than he probably realized. Up ahead, Paul sat stiffly next to his daughter Grace, who now clutched her stuffed rabbit with more focus than fear. Raina felt a pull in her chest. She didn't want to resent the child. This wasn't her fault. But the quiet damage was done. The performance, the manipulation, the assumption that Raina would fold just to avoid the optics of being the problem. She closed her eyes. This wasn't new. Not in airports, not in offices, not in classrooms. It wasn't about the seat. It never had been. It was about being expected to surrender space, dignity, peace, just to keep the peace. But not this time. From the front of the cabin, Claire reappeared. Her voice was calm, her movements purposeful. She stopped briefly beside Raina, kneeling slightly to her level. "I just wanted to check in," she said. "Are you all right?" Raina appreciated the discretion. Claire hadn't made a show of concern. It wasn't performative. It was respectful. "I'm okay," Raina replied, then paused. "Thank you for not letting it escalate further." Claire's mouth curled into a small, appreciative smile. "You didn't let it escalate. You stayed calm. That matters." There was a beat of silence between them, and then Claire added quietly, "People assume we're trained to diffuse conflict. What they don't always know is that we also watch for patterns, tone, who gets heard and who gets dismissed." Raina looked up, surprised, but Claire's expression was steady and sincere. "I've seen this play out before," she continued, "and it doesn't always end with dignity. I'm glad it did this time." Raina gave a soft, surprised laugh, tired but grateful. "Me too." Claire stood, gave a gentle nod, and moved on. Across the aisle, Marcus looked over again. He seemed to hesitate for a moment, then leaned slightly toward her. "If you don't mind me saying," he began, "you handled that better than most people would have." Raina tilted her head, not unkindly. "Most people? Most people don't get asked to give something up and then be called selfish when they don't," he clarified. "And most people, especially under pressure, either shut down or lash out." Raina folded her hands over her book. "I wanted to," she admitted. "Lash out, I mean." Marcus gave a soft chuckle. "Yeah, I saw that in your eyes." She allowed herself a small smile. It was strange how talking to a stranger felt more grounding than anything else that day. "What's your name?" she asked. "Marcus Wells," he said, extending a hand. "Oakland native, devoted uncle, frequent flyer." "Raina Carter," she said, shaking it. "Writer, Not so frequent flyer. They shared a quiet laugh. It was the first time Raina had felt the tension in her chest begin to ease. Time passed. Grace eventually leaned against the window and fell asleep. Paul, for all his earlier posturing, now sat with his arms folded, staring straight ahead, his jaw still clenched. Raina caught him glancing back once. His expression wasn't one of remorse, but something closer to confusion, as if trying to understand how the moment had slipped out of his control. It was then that Tomas, the second flight attendant, approached Paul's row. He didn't speak, just knelt beside the girl and handed her a small coloring kit with crayons and stickers. "For Grace," he said softly. "Sometimes it helps." Paul opened his mouth, possibly to object, but then said nothing. He simply nodded. Raina saw the way Grace's expression shifted. The rabbit now sat quietly in her lap while she peeled a sticker shaped like a balloon and pressed it to the page. Raina had no doubt that one day the girl would remember this flight, but perhaps not the way her father intended. The seatbelt sign blinked on, signaling their descent into the city. The captain's voice crackled overhead, warm and casual, giving the local time and weather. Around them, passengers stirred, stretching and reaching for bags, shifting back into the rhythm of air travel. But something had shifted. A woman across from Raina, the one with the ponytail who had spoken up earlier, leaned across the aisle and said quietly, "I hope this isn't the last time we speak up for each other." Raina nodded. "It won't be. It can't be." As the plane began its descent, Marcus looked over once more. "Have you ever written about moments like this?" he asked. "Sometimes," she replied. "But this one feels like it's writing itself." The wheels touched down on the runway, but something deeper had already landed. Raina Carter had claimed her seat, but she had also reclaimed something greater: her agency, her voice, her space. And the cabin, once full of passive silence, now carried something else entirely. A quiet, powerful shift. Well, the plane rolled to a gentle stop at the gate, the familiar chime of arrival breaking through the cabin's low murmur. Passengers unbuckled seatbelts and stood to retrieve their carry-ons, but Raina Carter remained seated, her hands still clasped in her lap. The moment was over, or at least, that's what it would appear to anyone watching. But for Raina, the true impact of what had happened was only beginning to settle in. This had been about far more than a seat. It had been about this expectation to yield, the assumption that her peace could be bartered for someone else's comfort. And most of all, it had been about the choice to say no, not out of spite, but from a place of quiet, resolute self-worth. Beside her, Marcus Wells also remained seated, glancing toward her with a half-smile. "You good?" he asked softly. Raina nodded, exhaling slowly. "Yeah, I think I am." From the front of the cabin, Claire, the flight attendant, reappeared. She stepped forward and raised her voice just enough to be heard above the rustling of jackets and bags. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin deplaning, I want to thank you for your patience during today's flight. Your cooperation helped ensure a safe and respectful environment for everyone on board." There was a slight pause, and though Claire didn't say it outright, her eyes briefly met Raina's. That pause carried weight. Passengers began filing out, one row at a time. Some glanced at Raina as they passed, a few offering small nods or quiet words, subtle acknowledgments. Not pity, not discomfort, but something closer to understanding. An older woman paused near Raina's row and leaned down. "You reminded me of myself at your age," she said. "Back when I thought I had to smile and stay small. You didn't. Good for you." Raina smiled softly. "Thank you." Marcus gathered his things and slung his bag over one shoulder, then turned to her. "Listen," he said. "If you ever publish something about this or anything like it, I'd read it." She chuckled lightly. "Noted." They exchanged one last look. Then he nodded and stepped into the aisle. As he walked away, Raina watched him blend into the stream of passengers exiting into the bright, sterile glow of the jet bridge. She stood slowly, retrieving her own bag from the overhead bin, and waited until the last of the line had cleared. Claire approached her once more, her voice now quieter, more personal. "We filed an incident report," she said. "The captain spoke with Mr. Whitmore before we departed. There will be follow-up." Raina raised her eyebrows slightly. "You didn't have to do that." Claire shook her head. "We did. Because people like you shouldn't have to carry the weight of dignity alone." Raina swallowed the lump that rose unexpectedly in her throat. She nodded and stepped into the aisle. As she made her way up toward the front of the cabin, she passed Paul Whitmore and his daughter Grace. He sat stiffly, gaze fixed straight ahead, avoiding her entirely. But Grace, holding her stuffed rabbit loosely, looked up. Their eyes met for a brief second. Raina offered her a faint smile. The girl blinked, uncertain, then gave a shy nod before turning her head back toward the window. Raina stepped off the plane and into the terminal, greeted by the cool, conditioned air of the airport and the swirl of travelers moving in all directions. She stood still for a moment, letting the buzz pass around her, grounding herself. Outside the arrivals area, the afternoon sun filtered through the tall glass panels. She made her way to the curb, where a rideshare driver held a sign with her name on it. As she slid into the back seat and gave her destination, her phone buzzed. A message from her younger sister popped up on the screen. "How was the flight? Made any new enemies?" Raina stared at the message, then slowly typed back. "It was eventful. I'll tell you everything." But I stood my ground, and it mattered. As the car pulled into traffic, the city unfolded around her. Tall buildings, honking horns, strangers with lives she'd never know. Yet something inside her felt changed. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't fought. She hadn't cried. She had simply stayed seated, firm, grounded, unmovable. That had been enough to shift an entire moment. She opened her notes app and began typing. Not because she needed to capture the moment, but because that's what writers do. We write to understand, to give shape to what's too big to hold in one thought. And this wasn't just about her, it was about every person who had ever been asked to make themselves smaller, more accommodating, more palatable. She wrote, "Sometimes, strength looks like movement, marches, protests, speeches. But sometimes, strength is stillness, the kind that doesn't budge, even when the world expects you to. Today, I didn't move. And maybe tomorrow, someone else won't either. That's how change begins." She hit save, and for the first time since the flight, she let herself relax. The world outside rushed by, the noise of the city now familiar and grounding. In the rearview mirror, the driver caught her eye and offered a nod. She wasn't sure if he had heard or known, but somehow that didn't matter. What mattered was that she knew, and knowing made all the difference. In a crowded airplane cabin, a single act of resistance unfolded quietly, but carried the weight of generations behind it. Raina Carter boarded that flight expecting nothing more than solitude and a window seat she had paid for. What she encountered instead was a challenge not just to her reservation, but to her dignity. When Paul Whitmore, a well-dressed father, demanded that she move to accommodate his daughter, Raina stood her ground, not with anger, not with theatrics, but with unwavering calm and clarity. What followed was more than a confrontation. It was a test of how society views entitlement, empathy, and the unspoken burdens people like Raina carry. In the face of subtle intimidation and public pressure, she chose not to yield. Not because she lacks compassion, but because she had learned that constantly bending to accommodate others is a cost too high, especially when it's expected without question. This story is about more than a seat on an airplane. It's about space. Who feels entitled to it? Who is asked to give it up? And who is expected to do so quietly? Raina's decision to stay seated was a quiet form of protest, but also a powerful reclaiming of worth. Her calm defiance was not just personal, it was symbolic. It showed that dignity is not something others can grant or revoke. It is something we affirm within ourselves, especially when the world challenges it. The lesson is clear. Kindness should never be coerced, and respect is not something you earn by raising your voice. It is something we owe each other simply by being human. In everyday life, we are often asked to make ourselves smaller, more agreeable, more accommodating. But there are moments when the most courageous thing we can do is say, "No, I belong here." In those moments, whether in boardrooms, classrooms, airports, or sidewalks, may we all remember Reina's quiet strength. May we learn to stand our ground when it matters, to honor our own value even when it's inconvenient to others. Because change doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply refuses to move, and that refusal can echo farther than we ever imagined. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support gives us the motivation to keep creating powerful, meaningful content that inspires and uplifts.